Brief analysis of Wilfred Owen's Disabled. It's a poem that tells the story of a singular disabled soldier who sits in a park, and then the persona of the poem reflects on what the journey of that particular soldier would have been like. This soldier is someone who saw combat at the front in World War I and has returned as a multiple amputee, having lost both their limbs, both their legs, and at least one of their arms. So it's quite a tragic story. It's quite an awful poem in that regard, but it has a lot to teach us about the plight of soldiers returning from World War I. We can see that it's divided into stanzas, as poems are, but in between the stanzas we have these asterisks, and they indicate that time has passed. And indeed, one of the main issues, one of the main foci of the poem is this idea of time and about the way in which time can move both fast and slow, and the fact that for this soldier last year seems a long time ago and he's aged a lot in just 12 months. It is a poem that pairs well with mental cases. Whereas mental cases looks at the psychological toll of warfare, here we're looking at the physical toll of warfare through a single soldier who's returned from the front. So if we have a look in that first stanza with the 6 lines there, he sat in a wheeled chair waiting for dark. We have the alliteration of the semivowel w with wheeled chair and waiting. It's tethering the idea of waiting, of being sedentary, to the wheelchair, that he is not an active fellow, this soldier. He is now passive and has to just receive whatever comes his way. Dark here is a metaphor, pretty straightforward. He's waiting for dark, he's waiting for the end of the day, literally, but he's also waiting for the end of his life, the ultimate darkness that will engulf him. On to the second line, and shivered in his ghastly suit of grey, we have the alliteration of that guttural g sound, the hard G coming through, creating a bit of a cacophonic tone. The suit there, clothing, will return in the poem a bit later on and become some really important imagery. Legless, sewn short at elbow, we have the, in green there, we have the sibilants of sewn short, and also the phrasing becomes a little bit truncated in the same way that his limbs are literally truncated, that they have been cut off. We also have a full stop in the middle of this line, that this line is sort of broken in half in the same way that the soldier has been broken physically. Through the park voices of boys rang, saddening like a hymn. We have the simile of like a hymn, and so we're creating a bit of an algaic tone, making it seem a bit like an elegy here. Voices gets repeated in the next line, so we have that repetition of that, or that anaphora, and it's boys singing. In so many of Wilfred Owen's poems, he does look at the corruption of youth, and here we have youth being uncorrupted, but the soldier knows a bit better than that, knows that these youths are just as corruptible as he was. Voices of play and pleasure, we have the alliteration of the plosive P sound, till gathering sleep had mothered them from him. Here Wilfred Owen takes a noun and turns it into a verb, and it creates quite a gentle effect, that these boys have been taken away from him in the same way that his youth has been taken away from him, and not by some big baddie, but rather has been mothered away from him, that this idea of boyhood and youthfulness and innocence has been taken away by the very people who ought to have been protecting it. About this time, so again we're looking at this idea of time and the juxtaposition between how things used to be and how things are now for the subject of the poem. About this time, town used to swing so gay. We have a lot of alliteration in this stanza. Things really amp up in terms of the oral devices, the sibilant devices that we're using here. So we have the t-t alliteration, that fricative alveolar coming through, of town, that being personified with a capital T, that it doesn't matter where we are, we could be anywhere in England. Used to swing so gay, we have the sibilants there, and then the gay meeting up with glow lamps, girls glanced and grew in the next two lines after it, so that g sound coming back, that guttural G coming back from the second line of the first stanza. We have, whereas we had voices in the first stanza, now we're focusing on our sense of sight. We have glow lamps and the light blue trees, and the girls are glancing lovelier, and the air is growing dim. Okay, so we're focusing now on the sense of sight and what things looked like. Again, we're focusing on youth with budded, the idea of a youthful bloom budding here in the light blue trees. We have that natural imagery coming through with budded and blue as well. The fact that the air grew dim is a bit of foreshadowing. The tone of the poem is shifting slightly from something wonderful to foreshadowing what's going to happen. Then we have in the old times, again, this sense of time coming through. Before he threw away his knees. He threw away gives a sense that he has agency, or at least he had agency, and that he was careless with the way he acted. Perhaps Wilfred Owen here is reprimanding the soldier, or perhaps he's mocking the idea that this soldier would willfully throw away his knees, and he's being satirical in this instance. We have the alliteration of knees, now, and never. And so the idea of he used to have his knees, but now he will never have them again. Time is conflated here in the now and the never, the present and the future. So we've also got the juxtaposition between in the old times and now from the fifth and fourth lines there. He will never feel again how slim girls' waists are, or how warm their subtle hands. Waists and warm, the semivowel there. Just joining those two ideas together, that the waists are also warm. All of them touch him. We've got 5 syllables there. Like some queer disease, we've got 5 syllables there, so the line is split neatly in half between the yellow bit on the left there and the blue bit on the right there. That all the girls touch him, but not in the way he wants. The simile, like some queer disease, really dehumanizes the soldier who has returned, and he becomes more of a curiosity than an object of desire. And the sensual nature of this stanza, with the feeling of the slim waists and the warm, subtle hands, is really undercut by the fact that he's treated like some kind of queer disease. Move along now to the third stanza. There was an artist silly for his face. Again, we're looking at this idea of time. There was an artist, then last year in the grey there, and then in the third line, now he is old. And so there's a sense that there is again this sense of the juxtaposition between what used to be the case and what is now the case. There was an artist silly for his face. He's so beautiful, so youthful, so alive that it sends others silly. For it was younger than his youth. We have this paradox, or this hyperbole happening here, younger than his youth, last year, and we get the alliteration as well of that semivowel, younger, youth, year, y sound coming through. Now he is old. Just a year later he is old, when last year he was younger than his youth. His back will never brace. The plosive alliteration there, showing the sort of the violence, I guess, that's coming through, and the acerbic tone that Owen's starting to adopt. He's lost his colour. Figurative language, metaphorical language here. He's lost his colour, lost his verve, his sense of liveliness. Very far from here. Poured it down shell holes till the veins ran dry. So that active verb there. Again, perhaps it's being satirical, the fact that no young man would willfully pour their colour, their sense of life, their sense of self down some shell holes. Or perhaps he is reprimanding the soldier for being so naive. And half his lifetime lapsed in the hot race and leap of purple. We've got the alliteration of that lateral L sound, and then the purple, spurted from his thigh. Purple obviously referring to the colour of blood. Blood is red, it's sort of that end of the spectrum, the colour spectrum, but also having the symbolic connotations of regency, of being a regal colour. It's spurting from his thigh, from his loins. This is his lifeblood that is being wasted, that's being poured down some shell hole until his veins run dry. Now we're moving on to stanza 4, and this is a bit of a different stanza. It's not as jam-packed, full of techniques. It tells the story of something that once happened, or what used to happen to this particular soldier. So it reads, one time he liked a blood smear down his leg. So one time, again, that reference to time. After the matches carried shoulder high. So we've got this image of him as a champion being carried through, being carried off the field. It was after football when he'd drunk a peg. Presumably a measure of alcohol, perhaps being used here simply because it will rhyme with meg a couple of lines later, and then beg after that. We've got leg with peg, with meg, with beg. He thought he'd better join. He wonders why. We've got this litotes, this understatement. He wonders why, the alliteration of the W coming through there as well. I would even argue that perhaps it's a reference to Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade, when he says, there's not to wonder why, there's but to do and die, talking about the 600 cavalry who charged at some big guns, some cannons, and died. And in that stanza, Tennyson writes, even though they knew someone had blundered. And so here, Wilfred Owen picking up on that idea of perhaps the brass or the higher-ups in the military have blundered, and that's why the soldier finds himself as a multiple amputee some years later, or 1 year later. Someone, very vague, could be anyone, that indescript pronoun here. Someone said he'd look a god in kilts. And so picking up on this costuming from the suit that he's wearing sewn short at the elbow, and now him imagining that he'd be wearing kilts in the trenches, in the mud of World War I. That's why, and maybe to please his Meg. We've got the repetition of the homophone to and to, and we have the fragmentation of the line through the semicolon and the two. Again, the two commas there, to please his Meg, so the girlfriend that's no longer around. Yes, it was to please the giddy jilts. Jilts being a bit of an archaic term, or British slang at least, for those who would jilt their lovers. So Meg being framed as someone inconstant, even at this point here. He asked to join, similar to the way in which he poured his lifeblood, his colour, away from him, and he threw away his knees. Now he's asking to join. He used to have agency over his life and be active. He didn't have to beg. Smiling, they wrote his lie, age 19 years. So again, we see this idea of youth, that he's putting his age up a couple of years. He's probably 16 or 17 himself, but wants to go off and serve. Germans he scarcely thought of, or their guilt, and Austria's did not move him, and no fears of fear came yet. We have the personification of fear, that he does not yet fear. He does not yet fear, and it's nothing to do with him trying to fight an enemy. So the soldier retains his innocence even as he's going off to potentially kill or murder, as Wilfred Owen would call it in some of his other poems, these Austrian and German forces. He thought of jewel hilts for daggers in plaid socks, so again of a dress uniform, and not what would actually become of him in the trenches, and definitely not what would become of the suit that he wears in stanza 1. Of smart salutes, we have the sibilants of smart salutes. and care of arms and leave and pay arrears. So we've got the polysyndeton, that repetition of the and creates this accumulative effect that we're just building up great thing after great thing after great thing, esprit de corps, and hints for young recruits that there's a veritable pile of wonderful, wonderful reasons for him to join the army, and it's got nothing to do with the negativity of trying to destroy the Hun. And soon he was drafted out with drums and cheers. So it's these war drums, this celebration that is drawing him further toward the battlefield, and not any kind of negativity. So the soldier retains his innocence through all of this. Smallest stanza here, the 5th stanza of the poem. Some cheered him home, but not as crowds cheer Goal. So we've got this disjunction, roughly the center of the line, not quite. It's not quite a caesura. We've got four syllables on the left there and 6 on the right, but we do have this disjunction, this sort of turning point. Some cheered him home, but not as crowds cheer Goal. That there's been a distinct shift in the way that the world is going to be treating him. Personification of Goal, perhaps, that it's some kind of great celebration, some kind of victory, and that this soldier, despite the fact that he's given multiple limbs to securing victory for Britain, he does not get to share in that. Only a solemn man who brought him fruits. The solemn man obviously could have brought him anything, but this is the fruit of his labour. Is the life that he now leads in desolation. The man thanks him and then inquired about his soul, and so the victory is being linked here to the idea of one's eternal salvation, and the acerbic tone really comes through here, that Owen is not saying that this man is a nice person, that instead he doesn't really care about the soldier, but rather is just there because out of some kind of obligation to religion. Shifting into the final stanza, again we have that time stamp, that now he will spend a few sick years. The years are sick, perhaps they've been personified. In institutes, I guess you could say that there's assonance within institutes. And do what things the rules consider wise. So again, perhaps personification here, definitely figurative language, what the rules consider wise. And so it's the wisdom of others that is going to dictate him, and it's going to be the most boring, mundane life that he has, over which he has no control. And take whatever pity they may dole, that he's going to be a recipient of pity rather than doing things actively for himself as he used to. Tonight he noticed how the women's eyes, again eyes so important in Wilfred Owen's poetry, it seems to truly be a window to the soul, to use that cliche. They passed from him. They don't pass over him, but I think there's still perhaps a biblical allusion that we could tap into there, that they're passing over him, this time not in terms of sparing him from anything, but rather that he is not one of the chosen ones, so subverting that Exodus story from the Bible and the Passover. Passed from him to the strong men who were whole, the strong men who were whole, both literally, I think, and also figuratively, that he's become quite a fractured version of himself. How cold and late it is. We've got this pathetic fallacy, if we like. It's at least a metaphorical language here, or symbolic imagery. How cold and late it is. Why don't they come and put him to bed? This great line of enjambment there, put him to bed, looking at a metaphor there for death, tapping into the darkness of the very first line of the poem when he's waiting for dark. Now he's waiting for bed in the final poem, in the final line of the poem. And then why don't they come? The repetition there, that there's no one coming for this man, that he has no help, no assistance in all the world. So that was a brief rundown of some of the poetic devices, some of the language forms and features that you might like to consider when talking about or discussing or writing about this particular poem.